The submersible spotlight cuts through 600 meters of black water, and for a moment, nobody on the support vessel breathes. What hangs suspended in that beam should not exist. Not here, not at this depth, in this darkness, where the Gulf Stream has erased every trace of human ambition for 10,000 years. The pilot, the only person alive to lay eyes on this place in person, the only one whose hands have touched the controls close enough to feel the pressure groan against the hull keys, the radio, with a voice that has gone strangely quiet. He describes granite, not rubble, not natural basalt shaped by chance and current. Cut granite arranged in angles that argue with the seafloor itself. Pyramidal forms rise from the silt like the spines of something buried and only half forgotten, their faces too clean, their corners too precise for tectonic accident. The sonar had hinted at this for years, strange geometric anomalies off the western edge of Cuba, dismissed in academic circles as a trick of acoustic shadow, a glitch, a stone reef misread by overeager equipment. Mainstream geologists had a name ready before anyone even descended: pareidolia, the mind's hunger to see order in chaos. But the pilot is not imagining the 90-degree intersections beneath his hull. He is not imagining the symmetry repeating block after block into the gloom, vanishing past the limit of his lights into a darkness that suggests scale rather than coincidence. If these structures were built by human hands, the mathematics of sea level alone make a claim no textbook is prepared to defend, a claim that would place builders here while glaciers still gripped half the planet, long before the first brick was ever laid at Sumer or Giza. So what precisely are we looking at, and whose history have we agreed for over a century not to ask about? The official record on this matter is brief and notably reluctant. In the early 2000s, a marine engineering team surveying the seabed off the Guanahacabibe's peninsula returned with sonar imagery that briefly captured public attention: geometric shapes, sharp-edged formations, structures that bore an uncanny resemblance to a sunken city. For a few months, the story moved through international press as a tantalizing possibility. Had a Cuban Atlantis been found? Then, almost as quickly as it surfaced, the story receded. The dominant academic explanation settled into something deliberately unremarkable. These formations, the consensus argued, were the product of natural, geological processes, limestone, and granite deposits, shaped over millennia by shifting currents, sediment compaction, and the ordinary violence of plate tectonics. Block-like patterns, researchers explained, can emerge from columnar jointing, a well-documented phenomenon in which cooling volcanic rock fractures into deceptively uniform shapes. No human hand required. No further state-funded expedition was authorized. No peer-reviewed paper offered a definitive survey of the site. The matter was filed quietly, under unconfirmed and unlikely, a phrase that, in the language of institutional science, functions less as a conclusion than as a closed door. For nearly 2 decades, the story existed only in fragments: a few photographs, secondhand sonar readouts, and the testimony of a research team that largely stopped speaking publicly about what they had seen. The official position, in essence, asks the public to accept an extraordinary coincidence that nature, unaided by intention, arranged stone into right angles, repeating intervals, and structural symmetry at a depth and scale that some geologists themselves privately admit is difficult to explain. It is a tidy answer. The deeper question is whether it is the correct one. Geology, examined closely, does not behave the way the official explanation requires it to. Columnar jointing, the natural process most often cited to explain away the formations, produces hexagonal or polygonal columns, the result of predictable stress fractures as molten rock cools and contracts. It is real and it is well documented, visible in formations like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. But columnar jointing does not produce stepped pyramidal structures. It does not produce flat plazas bordered by what appear to be processional avenues. And it does not explain why several of the formations, according to the original survey team, displayed faces meeting at angles closer to 90 degrees than any natural fracture pattern would predict. There is a second inconsistency, more difficult to dismiss: depth. The structures rest at roughly 2,000 feet below current sea level. For any human-made structure to exist at that depth, it would need to have been built when the coastline sat dramatically higher than it does today, which, according to established sea level reconstructions, would place construction somewhere in the range of 50,000 to 75,000 years before the present. That number does not align with anything in the accepted timeline of human civilization. It does not align with the earliest known cities. It does not align with the earliest known agriculture, writing, or organized stonework anywhere on Earth. Mainstream archaeology holds, with considerable confidence, that complex, monumental construction did not begin until roughly 6,000 years ago, give or take. A formation at this depth, if proven artificial, would not simply push that timeline back. It would shatter the framework entirely, placing sophisticated builders on Earth during the depths of the last ice age, a period when conventional history insists humanity was composed exclusively of small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands. One explanation requires only basic geology, the other requires rewriting everything. If the conventional timeline cannot accommodate what lies off the Cuban coast, an alternative framework has quietly persisted at the margins of historical inquiry, one that does not rely on extraterrestrial intervention, but on something arguably more unsettling: a forgotten chapter of human history itself. The theory holds that long before the recognized cradles of civilization rose in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, a sophisticated maritime culture flourished during the final millennia of the last ice age, a period when global sea levels sat over 400 feet lower than today, exposing vast coastal shelves now drowned beneath the world's oceans. Proponents of this view point to a striking pattern. Anomalous underwater structures have been reported not only off Cuba, but off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, in the Gulf of Khambat near India, and along stretches of the Mediterranean shelf, each lying at depths consistent with the same catastrophic flooding event, the same vanished coastline. Rather than isolated curiosities, these sites form what some researchers describe as a submerged network fragments of a once connected civilization that built along coastlines precisely because those coastlines at the time represented the most fertile, accessible, and strategically valuable land on Earth. When the ice sheets melted in a series of rapid pulses near the end of the Pleistocene, that civilization's primary infrastructure did not decay gradually. It drowned all at once, leaving behind ruins that the rising sea then sealed beneath silt, coral, and centuries of accumulated obscurity. This is not Atlantis as Hollywood myth, the theory's defenders insist, but Atlantis as displaced memory, a genuine maritime culture whose existence was preserved only in fragmented oral traditions and the symbolic language of flood narratives found across nearly every ancient culture on the planet, from Mesopotamian cuneiform to the Hebrew scriptures to Mesoamerican codices. If even one of these underwater sites is confirmed as artificial, the theory argues the rest become exponentially harder to dismiss as coincidence. The deepest scrutiny of the Cuban site centers on details the original survey team described but rarely elaborated upon publicly, details that, if accurate, move the formations from merely suggestive to genuinely difficult to explain away. According to first-hand accounts from the engineers involved in the initial sonar mapping, the underwater terrain revealed not a single anomaly, but an entire complex distinct structures, arranged with what appeared to be deliberate spacing, separated by what looked like open corridors or roadways, rather than the random scatter one would expect from natural rockfall or erosion. Several formations exhibited a stepped, terraced profile, rising in distinct tiers, rather than the smooth or jagged slopes typical of geological accretion. Photographic and video material captured during the original dive, limited in quantity and largely unreleased to the public in full resolution, reportedly shows surface textures inconsistent with eroded limestone. Some witnesses described faces of the structures as unnervingly smooth, in contrast to the heavily encrusted, coral-pitted surfaces found on the surrounding seafloor. If true, this discrepancy matters enormously. Porous, unworked stone accumulates marine growth uniformly. A surface that resists that accumulation or shows growth patterns interrupted by clean geometric edges suggests a different material history entirely, one involving deliberate shaping rather than millennia of passive erosion. There is also the matter of orientation. Multiple structures within the formation reportedly align along consistent axes relative to one another, rather than the directionally random fracture patterns expected from tectonic stress or volcanic cooling. Natural geological processes, however violent, rarely organize themselves into a shared coordinate system. Perhaps most provocative is a detail mentioned only briefly in early press coverage and almost entirely absent from subsequent discussion. Sonar operators reported registering what they described as a small number of carved or inscribed surfaces distinct from the surrounding stone in both texture and pattern markings that, if verified, would represent the single most consequential discovery in the history of submerged archaeology. No follow-up expedition has been permitted to verify these markings directly. No independent research vessel has returned with updated, peer-reviewed imaging. The site remains functionally exactly as it was the day the cameras went dark, a body of evidence frozen in a state of permanent ambiguity, neither confirmed nor disproven, existing only in secondhand testimony and degraded footage that institutions have shown little appetite to revisit. It is rare in the history of archaeology for evidence this potentially significant to simply stop being investigated. Every alternative history requires a villain, an institution whose interests are served by silence. In this narrative, suspicion gathers around several familiar names, though the truth may be less a conspiracy than a quieter, more bureaucratic kind of neglect. Cuba's unique political position offers part of the explanation. For decades, the island operated under strict diplomatic and economic isolation from the United States, the nation with the greatest concentration of marine archaeology, funding, equipment, and academic interest in the Western Hemisphere. Any American-led expedition to formally investigate the site would have required a level of international cooperation that simply did not exist during the most relevant decades of the Cold War and its aftermath. The original survey itself was a commercial venture, contracted for an unrelated engineering purpose, not a dedicated archaeological mission, meaning no institution with the authority or funding to pursue verification ever had direct jurisdiction over the find. Beyond geopolitics, there is the matter of institutional incentive. Mainstream archaeology operates on established timelines, funding structures, and academic reputations built around the existing chronology of human civilization. A confirmed Ice Age structure would not simply add a footnote to that chronology, it would invalidate foundational assumptions taught in universities for over a century, assumptions tied to careers, institutions, and entire academic departments built on the premise that complex civilization began where and when the textbooks say it began. This is not necessarily a deliberate plot orchestrated in a boardroom. It may be something more familiar and more human, a scientific establishment with little appetite for a discovery that would force it to admit how much it does not know, and a political climate that made follow-up investigation logistically and diplomatically inconvenient. Whether the silence stems from suppression or simple institutional inertia, the result is identical. The evidence sits untouched, 2,000 feet down, waiting for a willingness to look again that has, for over 20 years, failed to materialize. Consider, for a moment, the implications if even a fraction of this theory withstands scrutiny. The accepted timeline of human civilization is not a minor academic detail. It underpins how anthropologists interpret human cognitive development, how historians explain the emergence of agriculture, writing, and statecraft, and how the broader public understands its own origin story. That timeline insists complex, monumental construction is inseparable from settled agricultural life, that nomadic, Ice Age humans lacked the social organization, surplus resources, and architectural knowledge necessary to build anything resembling the structures resting off the Cuban coast. A confirmed pre-glacial structure would not simply add an asterisk to that narrative. It would suggest that sophisticated maritime societies existed, thrived, and vanished entirely beneath the historical record, not due to some dramatic erasure, but because their primary territory, the coastal lowlands most hospitable to early civilization, now lies submerged under hundreds of feet of ocean water across every continent on Earth. It would mean the conventional map of human history is missing, not a footnote, but an entire chapter 1 written along coastlines that no longer exist, in a world reshaped so thoroughly by rising seas that almost nothing remains above the waterline to prove it ever happened. It would mean flood myths, found with startling consistency across civilizations that never had contact with one another, are not shared metaphor but shared memory. And it would mean the ocean floor itself has been quietly guarding humanity's actual point of origin, 2,000 feet beneath the surface, in the dark, for longer than any pyramid has stood in sunlight. Somewhere off the western edge of Cuba, the light from a single submersible still lingers in memory, 600 meters down, illuminating angles that should not exist in a world as carefully mapped as ours claims to be. No second dive has confirmed what that lone pilot witnessed. No definitive paper has closed the question, in either direction. The site remains exactly where it has always been, patient, submerged, indifferent to the certainty of textbooks written in rooms that have never felt that particular darkness or that particular pressure. Perhaps it is limestone, shaped by an indifferent planet into a shape that only resembles intention. Or perhaps, somewhere beneath the silt and the coral and the accumulated weight of forgotten centuries, an entire civilization is still waiting to be believed. History, it turns out, may not be a settled record at all, but a coastline and coastlines, as the ice ages have shown again and again, are the most temporary thing on Earth. The next time the ocean retreats, what else might it reveal that we have already, quietly, decided not to look for?